Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the campus of Georgetown University and to another in a series of public conversations sponsored by the Religious Freedom Project of Georgetown's Berkley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. I'm Tom Farr. I'm a senior fellow at the Berkley Center, and I direct the Religious Freedom Project. Three propositions frame the work of the project. Proposition 1 is that religious liberty is important to individuals and societies. Proposition 2 is that religious liberty is in global crisis. Proposition 3 is that the first two propositions are highly contested. For that reason and others, the subject of religious freedom remains largely neglected by scholars, the media, and by policymakers. Our goal at the Religious Freedom Project is to address that problem by raising the intellectual profile, if you will, of religious liberty both here and abroad, through symposia, workshops, and conferences such as this one, through the work of our team of international and interdisciplinary scholars, the publications of books and articles, and through initiatives such as a new project we will formally announce later this summer, a 2-year study of the relationship between Christianity and freedom, both historically and among contemporary Christian minorities around the world. If you want to know more about what we're doing, check out our blue brochure and go to our website, which will provide a rich array of videos, transcripts, books, articles, and the like. We earnestly invite you to join us in this important conversation. Now, I'm pleased this morning to be moderating a bipartisan conversation between 4 members of the House of Representatives on the subject of religious freedom and the HHS mandate. I'll introduce them to you in just a moment. But before we begin, I want to tell you about a challenge we took on in organizing this conference. We decided to try and convince the Supreme Court of the United States to issue their ruling on the constitutionality of the Affordable Care Act precisely when we began the conference. And we have succeeded. It looks as if the ruling has now been issued. If we are reading the Supreme Court blog correctly, the court has upheld the Affordable Care Act. This means, there's some details, but I think basically that is the finding. This means that the issues we're going to discuss this morning are of continued salience, arguably even greater salience than ever. So let us begin. Let me give you a very brief introduction of our panelists in the order in which they will speak. You have their full bios in the program. Each is going to give brief opening remarks, after which we'll have a bit of a conversation among ourselves up here on the stage, but then we want to be sure and leave time for questions and discussion with the audience. So we'll set up a microphone here and we'll ask you to come to that mic when the time comes. First up is Representative Jeff Fortenberry, a Republican from Nebraska's 1st Congressional District. Among his many interests in Congress, perhaps the most salient to our question today is his focus on creating patient-centered health care and upholding family life and culture. He's the author of H.R. 1179, an amendment to the Affordable Care Act designed to protect rights of conscience. Representative Fortenberry earned a master's in public policy from Georgetown, so he's very much at home, and I might add, very welcome on this campus. Speaking second will be Representative Anne-Marie Buerkle, a Republican from New York's 25th Congressional District. Prior to serving in Congress, she served as the Assistant New York State Attorney General for 13 years, and prior to that as a pro bono attorney for the Central New York Women's Bar Association as an advocate for shelter for victims of domestic violence. She's a graduate of Syracuse University College of Law. Welcome to Georgetown, Ms. Buerkle. Third, we have Representative Diane Lipinski, Democrat of the 3rd Congressional District of Illinois. Congressman Lipinski co-chairs the bipartisan Congressional Pro-Life Caucus. He's focused on issues of health care, education, and immigration in Congress. Prior to serving in Congress, he worked for Congressman Richard Gephardt and taught political science at the University of Notre Dame and the University of Tennessee. 2 pretty good football teams there, Congressman. Congressman Lipinski has, among other degrees, a doctorate in political science from Duke University. Welcome, sir, to Georgetown. Speaking fourth will be Representative Diane Black, Republican from Tennessee's 6th Congressional District. In Congress, her work focuses on budgetary issues, health care reform, and pro-life issues. Prior to serving in Congress, Representative Black worked in the healthcare field for many years as a nurse, learning firsthand of the challenges facing our healthcare system, and was also a small business owner and an educator. Representative Black, you too are most welcome to Georgetown University. So let us begin. Congressman Fortenberry.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Farr, and it's a pleasure to be here with you all, and I'm grateful that you're taking a little bit of time to spend with us and talk about this most important issue. As Dr. Farr mentioned, I'm a graduate of Georgetown, and I apologize that we're running late a little bit today. When I heard the bells ringing at 10, it reminded me of scrambling to get into class in my academic career. But it's wonderful to be back here on campus and to be in this historic hall and this historic campus. I believe it was in this room when I was a student that Cardinal Bernardin gave his seamless garment speech, which went on to affect so much social justice policy as taught by the American bishops in the last several decades. And it was a wonderful opportunity for me to be here on this campus, to be exposed to all types of political leaders, religious leaders, societal, cultural leaders. And I want to commend Georgetown for holding this event today, particularly my good friend Scott Fleming, who accommodated this. Scott is the federal representative from the campus, and he spends a lot of time on Capitol Hill and just does an extraordinary job representing the great tradition here. So I'm grateful to Scott. I want to thank my colleagues as well for their willingness to participate. This is a pretty tough topic. It can be controversial. We don't necessarily see it that way. But it can be a tough topic because it gets misconstrued. There's a huge philosophical divide in our country about the proper approach to health care and what are the limits of governmental interference or governmental operations in this regard. And so my colleagues' willingness to speak boldly, speak publicly about their perspectives on this, in this regard is very meaningful to me. As we just heard, the U.S. Supreme Court apparently just ruled on the controversial health care case. I don't have the full details, so I can't necessarily comment. In fact, the details I got are a bit confusing as to what was upheld and what wasn't. So maybe we can unpack that in a little bit. But I was at the footsteps of the Supreme Court when these deliberations began. The scene there was robust. Americans who were in favor of the bill were chanting. Americans who were opposed to the bill were chanting. And tourists wandered by, interested in what all the excitement was about. And I reflect on the irony. There were Americans exercising their constitutionally protected rights of free speech and assembly to express their views of the constitutionality of this new health care law. And before the bill was even passed, my town halls on the subject were also very robust. Many people expressed very deep and sincere concern about the massive bill and its implications. Other persons expressed concern that the time to act in terms of healthcare reform in a comprehensive way, well, it's now, given the growing problem of affordability and pre-existing conditions. I conducted my own public meetings in a high school, in a hospital, and in a homeless shelter. I said at the time that we needed the right type of healthcare reform, healthcare that reduces costs and improves outcomes while protecting vulnerable persons. And after months of deliberation, Congress delivered a massively complex bill that shifts healthcare costs to more unsustainable spending and erodes healthcare liberties from my perspective. Now, given today's discussion, though, here is the problem. Buried in a law was a provision empowering the Secretary of Health and Human Services, Kathleen Sebelius, to issue rules on preventive services. Who could have predicted that she would use her authority, sanctioned by President Obama, who, by the way, I had a very pleasant conversation with last night at the White House picnic with my family, that they would force everyone, every American, to pay for drugs and procedures, including abortion-inducing drugs, that violate the fundamental ethical sensibilities of many Americans. As a legislator, what perhaps grieves me most is for the first time in the history of healthcare in the United States, this law would force everyone to choose to either obey the government or violate their personal convictions, stand for their deeply held beliefs, or stand convicted by government coercion, to choose between their conscience or their livelihood. That's a false choice. It's unjust, it's wrong, it's unnecessary, and that's un-American. And it is an affront to the very purpose of government derived from the consent of the governed. America owes its unique character and strength to empowering, protecting, and upholding the inalienable rights of her citizens. Healthcare should be about the common good, caring for the sick, caring for the wounded. Healthcare policy should not be a vehicle to drive divisive ideology, forcing Americans to violate their deeply held reasoned beliefs. The HHS mandate violates the fundamental principle of religious liberty and rights of conscience so dear to this country. Karen McGivney-Lechtel, one of my constituents, sent this email to me. She said, as a woman's health practitioner and as a Catholic, I need the ability to stay within my faith boundaries. I would be unable to work if I was required to provide the services this HHS mandate has imposed. The HHS ruling does seem to be most perniciously targeted at faith-based providers who are the backstop of compassionate care for our most vulnerable. Throughout our history, the U.S. healthcare system has in large measure owed its success to doctors, nurses, and healthcare providers staffing faith-based institutions. These institutions, which include hospitals, university clinics, and nonprofit healthcare centers, serve the common good of all Americans. The government should celebrate the contribution of these faith-based entities, fulfilling their mission of helping the sick and serving the poor. Without them, we will see reduced access to high-quality care, especially for vulnerable persons who have traditionally relied on these benevolent organizations of civil society. Several healthcare practitioners have told me that they would choose to leave their professions rather than compromise their beliefs. Undoubtedly, some will not obey. Our government has effectively condemned them. Another man who was condemned for his beliefs said this, I submit that an individual that breaks a law that conscience tells him is unjust and willingly accepts the penalty by staying in jail to arouse the conscience of the community over its injustice is in reality expressing the very highest respect for the law. So said Dr. Martin Luther King from the Birmingham jail. The purpose of our government is to create the just structures for societal order, empowering liberty, beginning with the affirmation of the natural rights of the person, including the most basic right of conscience. In my office, there is a copy of a draft of the Bill of Rights. The rights of conscience were initially included in that draft. By the final version, though, that right was formalized by the concept of religious freedom, perhaps given that the rights of conscience, per se, were such an ordinarily understood concept that its fullness did not need provision. James Madison, the architect of the Constitution, declared that, quote, conscience is the most sacred of all property, linking it to the foundation of religious liberty. In 1809, Thomas Jefferson said that, quote, no provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to a man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of the civil authority. The HHS mandate violates this fundamental principle. It flies in the face of long-standing bipartisan healthcare tradition. No American should be forced to violate their conscience to serve the public good. From the faith-based hospital to the business person providing coverage, healthcare coverage for their employees, to the school established for children with special needs, no American should be forced to choose between their faith and their job. To address this problem legislatively, I introduced the Respect for Rights of Conscience Act referred to by Dr. Farr long before the actual introduction of the HHS mandate, but in anticipation of the problematic provisions that may occur in the healthcare bill. The bill now has 224 co-sponsors, Democrats and Republicans. It is not about politics, it is not about partisanship, it is about principle. The legislation restores the rights of conscience to their proper place in the healthcare economy, long enshrined in law and our tradition. The legislation restores the operative ethical norm that has prevailed in our culture in this regard for generations. In fact, the language is similar to that proposed by Hillary Clinton in the 1990s, articulated by Senator Ted Kennedy, and signed into law by President Clinton in a form in the Balanced Budget Act of 1997. A strong bipartisan consensus for conscience rights carried through the 1990s and beyond. Sadly, it appears to have disintegrated in the recent national debate over the HHS mandate. I think it's important to ask the question, how could we, in the span of just a few short years, become so dulled to our first freedom, the freedom of religion, and the core principles of conscience rights from which that freedom flows? And that's why we're here today, and why so many people of goodwill, regardless of their religious traditions or political affiliations, consider the HHS mandate to be an affront to the very essence of what it means to be an American. Thank you, Dr. Farr.
Thank you. Ms. Buerkle.
Thank you, Dr. Farr. Good morning, everyone. It's wonderful to be back at Georgetown. I have 6 children, and one of my daughters graduated from Georgetown in 1997. And then to give you an idea of how quickly time goes by, I was here just a few short months ago with my oldest granddaughter, and we had a lovely tour of Georgetown. So it's wonderful to be back at this very fine institution. And I'm so glad to be here this morning to talk about a topic that really is so important to our nation. What was not mentioned in my bio was that I am a registered nurse also. So I was a nurse for many years and then went to law school and represented a large teaching hospital as an attorney for many years. So I really spent the bulk of my professional life in healthcare. So it's something that I'm passionate about, I care deeply about. And I think really the place to start the discussion is that we as Americans all agree that we need healthcare reform in this country. And then the question becomes, what will that healthcare reform look like? It will be interesting to flesh out the Supreme Court's decision later on this morning, and certainly I hope we can have an opportunity to discuss it today. But the question that our nation faces is, what do we want our country to look like? And I think the HHS ruling is a very integral part of that discussion. Our country, and if we look at the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson and our founding fathers gave us a moral imperative. It's a moral promise to this country that we have unalienable rights, and among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. They promised that if we adhered to those principles and understood that our rights and all of the rights we enjoy were God-given and didn't come from the government, that we would be a prosperous nation. The problem with, and one of the reasons I ran for Congress, I'm a freshman in 2010, was my opposition to the health care law, knowing we needed reform, but not understanding why we would put the government squarely between the physician and the patient and the health care decisions. So as a result of that, I ran for Congress, and I've looked at this and just taken this so seriously. But this whole debate about our nation and what the government's role is, it's not to grant us those rights as we see in the HHS ruling. It's to protect those rights. Those rights belong to us. The right of conscience belongs to us because it is God-given. And the only role of the government is to protect that right. And so when we get into a situation with the HHS rule, which is now granting us rights, we as a nation we've done a 180, and we've come so far away from what the experiment was that caused the greatest nation in the history of the world to exist, the United States of America. So that, I think, is really what is so serious and what's so profound about both the Health Care, the Affordable Care Act, as well as this conscience provision. One of the most essential, as a healthcare provider, one of the most essential pieces of practicing healthcare and being a provider is that you can respect and the system respects your deeply held beliefs. This HHS rule eliminates that. It is the most invasive government into our privately held beliefs and our conscience, and is of concern to me both as a healthcare professional, but more broadly as a nation, and what we want our nation to look like, and what we've come so far as to what this nation stands for. The understanding, again, that we have those rights, those deeply held rights, because because God gave them to us, and government's only role, the only role is to protect those rights, not to grant those rights. I want to just mention one other issue that has come up this year, and the HHS rule was the beginning and certainly the most pervasive, but in Oversight and Government Reform Committee, we had another hearing. It had to do with the United States Catholic Conference with regards to a grant they receive every year because they do such an outstanding job at sex trafficking and human trafficking throughout the world. They have several programs. But because the Catholic Church and the United States Catholic Conference of Bishops would not refer for abortion services or sterilization, they were not given that grant. So it's yet another example of how far we have come away from protecting the conscience, those deeply held beliefs. And I would, just concur with my colleague Jeff, and I take him, I just want to honor him this morning and just commend him on the leadership he has taken with HR 1199 and putting it out here and articulating the very important conscience provisions that we should have as Americans. But getting back to the human trafficking, so the United States Catholic Conference was not given that grant money, and it was given to organizations who were willing to refer for abortions and sterilizations. Again, asking or penalizing the Catholic Church because it would not violate its conscience and its deeply held beliefs. That's where we're at as a nation. And so as we go forward and we look at elections, we look at the big picture down to the HHS rule, it is really a question of what we want our nation to look like. Do we want our government granting us rights, or do we want our government in the very appropriate role of just protecting our rights? And the HHS rule and the overreach of the federal government, it's really probably the most serious. And I say it in my town halls, and I must tell you that folks in my district are so concerned about this, whether you're a healthcare provider or just the constituents. Any religions, and we've had hearings on this as well, the Jewish community, the Muslim community, those who don't, are without faith, that the government would begin to tell you what you have to believe or not believe or violate your rights of conscience. And I will just end with just a practical example. In addition to the overall concern about the overreach of the government, I have a large Catholic teaching hospital. It's where I trained as a nurse in my district. And I had a conversation with the administrator, and she said, here's the situation with this HHS mandate. We are a self-insured hospital. We have a lesser, smaller plan. We have about 8 subscribers where they deal directly with the insurance company. If the HHS mandate is upheld, and we have to go through with that, we will have to shift all of our employees out of the self-insured plan and into direct contact, and they'll have to get their insurance directly from the insurance company. She said their premiums will be significantly higher. They will lose the benefit of having us be self-insured and just have our insurance administered. So that's the economic. That is a very small piece, and I'm sure there's examples all over that when you ask an institution to violate their deeply held beliefs, there are going to be intended consequences, but there also will be unintended consequences. And in a law that was supposed to improve access and reform health care, we're going to end up with folks paying higher premiums and having less access to their health care. So again, it's wonderful to be here. Thank you, Dr. Farr, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you. Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Dr. Farr, and I thank Georgetown for holding this this morning, and thank Jeff especially for putting this together and all his work on this issue. Jeff and Anne Marie have gone through a lot of the philosophical on this, and even though I have a PhD in political science, I focus a lot more on the down to what exactly is going on here, what's the problem with it. But let me first say that I voted for the health care bill that first went through the House after the Stupak amendment was voted for and attached to the bill. I said that I would not vote for a bill that had coverage for abortion. It was the last thing that was done on that bill because the Democratic leadership did not want that to be done, but we got that done. Now the second time it went through, I also had other problems with the bill, but I said, well, let's just move this forward. Second time it went through, obviously, things were different. We had a different policy. We could not. I was part of the Stupak group, but when it came down to it, I said I could not accept the executive order. And I had said that all along. I stuck with that. I didn't think that it was going to protect life as it supposedly was claimed that it was going to. So I voted against the health care law on the final vote. And because of the abortion issue and a few other issues that I had disagreements with, we got to the point with the HHS mandate. And when the rule, the final draft, I guess, came out in August, I guess, of last year, and there was a lot of talk about it. You know, the requirement of covering, everyone likes to focus on in the media. Everyone who is in favor of this likes to talk about this just as contraception, as if all we're talking about is contraception can be legal or not legal in this country. I think we passed that a long time ago. But to require contraception, sterilization, and abortion-inducing drugs have to be covered. There were a number of Democrats who said that they were not happy with this. Even the House Democratic Caucus chair, John Larson, said he was not happy with it. Why? I think because there was really a groundswell of support, and people were hearing, especially from their Catholic constituents, that this was unacceptable. So after, 6 months, the rule was, they came forward and said they were going to keep that same rule. There's a lot of consternation even from Democrats. And then the administration announced a so-called accommodation. And let me just read, because I was just going through, look through what I had said in statements I had put out, and why redo something if I did it so well the first time. And I said, all the facts indicate the new mandate is the same as the old mandate. New words, same policy. Our understanding of new policy is now limited to a fact sheet put out by the White House. It seems like it's pretty accurate. There are no other facts beyond that, really. This document says religious organizations will not have to provide contraceptive coverage or refer their employees to organizations that provide contraception. Of course, this is their quote. Of course, it's all focusing contraception. That's all they wanted to talk about. But the health care law says that all employers must provide health insurance for their employees or pay a penalty. And according to the White House, these same insurance plans that employers must provide, quote, will be required to provide contraception coverage to these women free of charge, unquote. So religious organizations have to provide health care coverage from insurance companies that are required to provide abortion, drugs, sterilization, and contraception. What changed? This is the same policy. We need a rule that protects religious liberty by allowing employers to provide health insurance coverage that does not include abortion drugs and other services that violate their conscience and religious doctrine. Instead, we got a so-called compromise. There's no compromise at all and provides no options for those with profound religious and moral objections to providing these services. To say that the insurer and not the employer is required to provide the coverage is a fiction. There is no accommodation for religious liberty. The rule remains coercive and still violates the long-standing tradition of protection for conscience rights in federal law. And that's where we are today. Unfortunately, when that so-called accommodation was announced, there were many who decided they felt that the pressure was now off them and that they could go ahead and say, oh, this is okay. There's been an accommodation now made. to religious conscience. Clearly, that's not the case. I think we lost the PR battle in a matter of hours on that Friday. Not surprisingly, on a Friday. The first decision was put out on a Friday. This was put out on a Friday. And as soon as the media were able to describe this as an accommodation, that there were some indications that the Catholic Church, the bishops were considering this, looking at this. It was by Friday night. It was over. Now, we're here today because we believe this should not be over, and that there are enough Americans who understand, but we need more Americans to understand where we are at today and the threat that this is to religious freedom. It is an uphill battle that we are facing right now, but trying to draw the attention of people to what is going on here, as already Jeff and Anne Marie talked about, is the fundamental rights that we have as Americans. And certainly our freedom of conscience and being able to follow that, I think, is critical. I believe with the argument that was being used as the accommodation was announced, that, well, birth control, if an insurer covers birth control, then their costs actually go down. So there actually is not a cost for birth control. That just easily leads to the next argument that's going to be abortion has to be covered. And abortion, don't worry, no one has to pay for it because it's cheaper for an insurance company to abort a child than to have to pay for the birth and care for that child. I mean, that is not very far away. So no one wants to talk about that on the side that supports this, but clearly that's if they're going to use that logic, that is what follows next. It's interesting that the Amish were exempt from the Affordable Care Act, from the health care law, because they do not purchase insurance. Instead, they all agree within their church that they will take care of each other if someone has a health care issue, and they will pay for that. So the Amish were exempt, but clearly we're going very far the other way. And there's a lot of ideas that people have about why this was, that why would the Amish be exempt, but Catholics and others who have a moral conscience objection to abortifacients and sterilization and contraception were not exempt. I think that was a political issue as far as I'm concerned. So as we sit here, it sounds like the healthcare law, the mandate has been upheld, but this is something I believe is will be one of the next fights here, obviously, that goes to the court to protect religious freedom. So I think it's critical that we engage everybody that we can in this, I'm happy the Catholic Church is stepping forward, although I'd like to see, I would like personally to see more done on this. And I think that it's to a large extent a matter of informing people about what is going on. I thank you all for being here, and I thank all my colleagues here for the work that they are doing to try to turn this around legislatively and also raise the awareness of the American people to this threat on our freedom. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lipinski. Ms. Black.
Thank you, Dr. Farr, and thank Georgetown and especially Jeff for bringing us all together at this really historic time. I mean, this is truly a historic day where a historic decision has been made by our Supreme Court that means historic consequences, not only for our health care, but also for our freedom. And I must say that with this decision today, in my opinion, this is really an affront to our Constitution. And will really forever change that relationship between our government and our people. Because now a decision has been made to say that our government, of which, as Anne Marie said, was here, the Founding Fathers, to protect us from our government now is being very intrusive in our lives to tell us what it is that we may or may not do. Now, of course, beyond that decision, Obamacare, as now it seems that we are going to have it standing, has handed over an immense regulatory power to the Department of Health and Human Services to control just about every aspect of our health care in our country. And as we have seen, some of that unfettered power is being used to force religious organizations to violate their conscience and to pay for insurance plans that cover contraceptives and also abortion-inducing drugs. Now, that HHS mandate is an unprecedented assault on our First Amendment right to religious freedoms. As we have already heard the previous speakers speak about that. And even with the administration's so-called compromise, the president's still placing the health care law above our Constitution and religious freedom. And this is just really totally unacceptable. Last week, like many of you know, Mr. Fortenberry, as he mentioned, and also Dan mentioned, the Catholic Health Association rejected, and rightfully so, the HHS compromise on the mandate and requested more broad exemptions from its requirement that all employers provide coverage of contraceptives and abortion-inducing drugs. Now, the administration has set up really an impossible choice for our religious-affiliated institutions. Either you violate the law or you violate your conscience. And under the president's proposal, employers and employees obviously will still bear the cost of paying for the coverage of contraception and abortion-inducing drugs because the insurance companies obviously will simply pass this cost on. This free service will be passed on with higher premiums to the employer. That we know will happen. Now, obviously, the president supposedly walked back the contraceptive mandate is really a change in his rhetoric and not his policy, as Dan has already said. And it's not, it does not address either the constitutional problems with the mandate or its infringement on our freedom of religion for the American people. Freedom of religion should not be treated as a revocable privilege from our government. It was not set up that way, but instead as an inalienable gift from God, our Creator, as was so aptly said by Anne Marie. And the HHS mandate is yet another example of the president putting his personal political philosophies above the principles that were based upon our Constitution and the founding of our nation. So the public outcry against the HHS mandate has been undeniable. We have seen protesters that have demonstrated at the building outside of HHS and at other places around the nation. To date, we have 56 stakeholders that have filed 23 lawsuits against the administration. Despite this outpouring of objection, the Obama administration recklessly has continued down that path of unjustifiable burdens that burdens our religious and our moral conscience. And some of the Obama administration have sought to divide our opposition. They want us to believe that this is just a Catholic matter with the bishops, and they've even talked about it as being the war on women. But as you can see here today by this panel, because whether you're Catholic or not, and I am not Catholic, we know that our religious organization is being threatened and that we're all threatened by this. And as people of faith, any of us could be next. And I believe we must fight against a government so large and so intrusive that it's entering in our lives in unprecedented ways, ways that if we look back at our founding fathers, they would just never believe that our government could be so intrusive in our lives in so many ways. Now, in March of this year, the Senate Democrats band together against the Republicans to defeat the Respect for the Rights of the Conscience Act. We saw by a 51-48 margin adopted a motion to table or actually kill that act. More than half of our House, so it was a bipartisan, sponsored or co-sponsored the bill that Representative Fortenberry offered. Now, it is really incredibly disappointing that the Supreme Court has decided to uphold this law, in my opinion. One way or another, it is imperative that the rule be rescinded and that the law be repealed in its entirety. And in terms of this HHS mandate, we do have something called the Congressional Review Act that requires only a simple majority to repeal a law. And so come November, hopefully we're going to have some willing partners in both the Senate and the White House so that we can move forward and share our commitment to upholding the Constitution and protecting religious freedom by striking down this most onerous rule. I believe it's important to keep in mind that whether or not the HHS mandate is front and center in the news, that the fact remains the HHS mandate infringes on our religious beliefs. And as people of faith, and as Americans who respect our Constitution, we must continue to hold the administrator's feet to the fire and demand a repeal of this contraception rule. Sadly, the HHS mandate is really just one of so many ways that this law erodes our liberties. And I didn't bring the law with me, but if we had it sitting on the table, it is about this thick. It gives so many of the future decisions to HHS and whoever the secretary is in deciding what other freedoms can be taken away from us by the administration and not by Congress, where Congress, you have the right, you have the ability to address Congress. You do not have the ability to address the executive branch. I will continue, as I have for the past year and a half, to get this law off the books and ensure that our federal government doesn't say how Americans practice their religious convictions. And again, I thank all of you for being here, and I thank those who helped to put this together.
Thank you, Ms. Black, and thanks to all of our panelists. We want to get our audience involved in this conversation, so I'm going to exercise the privilege of the chair, if I could, if that's a phrase in our Constitution. It isn't, but I'm going to exercise it anyway. And ask the first question, but we have a microphone back here, and those of you who would like to ask a question, you might begin queuing up. I'm going to put this to Congressman Fortenberry, and then others who would like to jump in, please do. Let me just say, though, to clarify, for those of you who don't have BlackBerries or other means, just to repeat, the Affordable Care Act has been upheld as constitutional by the Supreme Court. The individual mandate that requires almost all Americans to contribute to purchase insurance was upheld constitutional, not on congressional power to regulate commerce, but on its power to tax. It was a 5-4 decision. Chief Justice Roberts joined the majority, gave them 5. The dissent was read by Justice Kennedy. Very interesting. The court, however, did not address the issue that its decision, except if it is not overturned, the HHS mandate, of course, is part of this law and will continue. And I think I'm correct that the 40+ entities that have sued on the basis of this HHS mandate as unconstitutional and as contrary to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act are the only constitutional challenges to the Affordable Care Act that remain. So the issue that we are discussing today is of heightened significance. Okay. Here's my question. Last March, our Religious Freedom Program held an event on the HHS mandate, and we had a couple of top legal minds on both sides of this. You can watch this debate on our website if you're interested. But since all of you opposed that mandate, let me put a couple of the arguments to you that those who were in favor of it posed in our debate. The Supreme Court has ruled in a number of cases that when the government is fashioning an exemption from otherwise generally applicable laws, it must take into account the effects the exemption will have on those persons the law is trying to reach. In this case, according to the government, all women. So the logic runs like this. The purpose of the HHS mandate is to provide contraceptive, abortifacient, and sterilization services to all women without a copay. Congress delegated to the HHS Secretary, Kathleen Sebelius, the responsibility to decide what preventive care should be provided as part of the Affordable Care Act. She relied on a study by the Institute of Medicine, which is part of the National Academy of Science. That study said the health of women and of unintended newborns would be increased by the provision of these services free of charge to all women. And furthermore, this argument goes, there is a broad social consensus in the United States that contraception is good for women and good for families. And here's the question, if it's Congress's judgment that universal free access to these services is a broad social good for women and families, why should women who work for Catholic or other religious institutions or individual employers not have free access to those services?
Well, first of all, I should probably reiterate, I didn't vote for this. And there were many, many reasons, but I find it interesting if you've directly quoted an expert in that or whether this is some unintentional wording problem. How is the health of the unintended newborn furthered by preventing their existence? Explain the logic of that. That to me
You're
is
answering the question.
The other thing you say is, what compelling reason does the government have to do this, just philosophically? What compelling reason is there to do this? Some access problem to people who want to choose, those types of, no, there is not. If the government wanted to directly subsidize it more heavily, which it does significantly in Medicaid particularly, they could do that. So why compel people who have some dilemma in their conscience, some ethical sensibility, who, by the way, many of which are involved in healthcare themselves, providing service to the very people that the government had suggested they're going to help, should be coerced into violating their beliefs, even forced out of that business. So then you have to conclude that this is not about some access to something, it's about an ideological issue. It is about a particular worldview and perspective being used by the strong arm of government to be imposing itself on Americans who, up to before the passage of this health care law, we didn't have that problem. That, again, is the irony of what you said. Where was the problem, if you believe that there was a problem to begin with? So it is this difficult scenario of forcing all Americans to choose whether or not reasoned beliefs are going to be trampled by a non-compelling interest of the government, where if you believe that the government should be doing that, you have other ways of achieving that through direct appropriations.
And your argument that it's non-compelling is based on the fact that it's already available? Is that your substantial argument?
It's pervasive.
Right. Contraceptive services. Yes, ma'am.
I just want to make one comment, and that is, because Diane alluded to it in her comments, the significance of the situation. So you take the Affordable Care Act, 2,000 plus pages. That's not the law. It's going to be then handed over to the agencies and to HHS. And then the regulators, and this is what happens in this situation, and then the regulators interpret and put their spin on what the law is. Now, those are unelected officials. They're really not accountable to anyone. They're generally a political appointment. And those regulations, the law may be interpreted one way, may be interpreted in several ways, but their interpretation is what will be binding, and this is with the HHS role. I'd be interested, this Institute of Medicine, I mean, we all know there are studies everywhere, and I'll bet for every study that you show that this is, and as Jeff mentioned, the unintended newborn, that some of the phraseology, if we take a step back and we say unintended newborn, we're talking about a human life. I mean, it's so offensive as a mother and a healthcare provider. But, you know, there are studies to the contrary that say, no, contraception is dangerous. It causes cancer, breast cancer. It has significant health ramifications for young, especially the young girls who are taking it without parental consent. So, but I wanted to just emphasize the point that so many of these laws then get handed over to the regulators. And what we have seen in this administration is that where we cannot go through the legislative process, where there will be obstacles to accomplishing a goal, it has gone through the regulatory process. And that is a way to get the agenda completed, and that's significant because we are elected to represent our districts and to enact laws that are representative of our district. And when we circumvent that process, our nation is in trouble.
I don't know if I could add very much to that. I'll just say it's I'm not an attorney. It's a bad law if it results in this being a requirement. But I think the real as a layperson, not an attorney, I would think that the compelling interest is really the key here. And I always think when there's talk about the compelling interest of this being, of these services being really critical preventive services, I'm diabetic and I pay much, much more with my insurance. I pay much, much more for things that I need to have in order to keep my diabetes under control and to have better health outcomes. And somehow that's not important. It really points to the fact that this is as Jeff said, I think this is a political attempt to push forward a particular view of a particular worldview. And I also do believe that there is some aspect of this that we all know where the opposition to this comes from. And I think there are concerns that, or I should say, this is being used politically against those who would disagree with it purposefully.
I am not an attorney, so it's very difficult for me to speak when you give me all that legalese, but let me just break it down. In my nursing mind, when I take a look at something, I always going to go back and look and say, okay, what was the original intent? And if you go back and listen to the discussions and read the transcripts of the discussions about why prevention was put in there to begin with, it was very clear that the intent of those preventative services for women were breast examinations, those kinds of services we typically think of to keep people healthy or to be able to determine early on if there is something there that we have to treat quickly so that we can make sure that they can maintain their health. And so making the case for saying that, that a contraceptive is a prevention of keeping someone healthy is quite a stretch. As a matter of fact, I believe that if we go down that line of thought, because I like exercise, and we have many studies out there to show that if women exercise and women eat right, that you actually do prevent many of those diseases that could potentially be there at the end of their life or at some point in their life. So maybe we ought to say, in defining preventive services, that we should give health care, free access to every spa or exercise place. You know, that would be something that we would say. And here's where the danger comes, is that as you, and I alluded to it, Anne-Marie went back to it, as you look at this law, or at this, as you look at the law and you say, where is the Secretary of Health going to have an ability to be able now to determine, because she has really, he or she has really unfettered ability to be able to say, okay, this is how I define prevention. This is how I define this section. This is why I believe this law is so dangerous. This is only one example of how this law is dangerous, and there is still much, much more to be written on it. And so prevention was not intended to ever be as it is being defined now, as the Secretary has defined it, as being prevention of pregnancy.
Very good. Let's go to our audience now, and if we don't touch it now, we will before we end. The question of defining terms, goes to the question of religion itself in this mandate. That is to say, what is a religion that ought to enjoy exemption, conscience exemptions? And perhaps somebody will ask a question about that, but we need to talk a little bit about it. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Nick Simontelli. I'm an alum. I want to follow up on Dr. Farr's question first. Thank you all for being here. So to engage a little bit with the kind of other arguments as well, I think one of the things that people who disagree have said is, what's the limiting principle then about when religious freedom trumps kind of a compelling interest? And it sounds to me like you have both a disagreement that birth control is a compelling interest, and even if it were a compelling interest, constitutionally you don't believe that it can be required of people who disagree on religious grounds. So I would ask you kind of what is your limiting principle to that? For instance, do you think an employer should be able to deny HIV drugs to a gay employee for moral or religious reasons?
You can turn the question around and ask yourself, what's the limiting principle of the government here?
I would say a compelling interest, that they would have to make a case.
The public interest?
They would have to make a case for a compelling interest.
What exactly? Does the government have a compelling interest to do this? That was related to the last question.
So then you would say the debate is about whether birth control is a compelling interest?
The compelling interest is whether or not what this prevention mandate has done tramples the rights of conscience and religious liberty, which were operative in our healthcare system until this new healthcare law and this authority was given over. In other words, to identify the problem before this new healthcare law came along. Just because the government is exercising some new authority, it is begging the question, though, as to why there is a need to coerce Americans who did not have to do this before to now do it in violation of moral precepts, rights of conscience, individual liberty, as well as religious freedom. This is a well-defined principle, long-held tradition, and precedent and operative in our culture, and it radically shifted with this healthcare law. That's why I think it's better to ask the question, what is the limiting principle of government in this regard?
But so would you disagree then that, or would you agree that HIV medication for gay employees is something a government could require an employee to provide? Or would you say they could require nothing?
Is there a case where this has been denied? I'm not aware of one. You can sit out there all day long and think of hypothetical situations in which somebody could claim some sort of bizarre notion that that's a religious or moral tenet. The courts are well suited to handle that kind of thing, but the general principle here is you should protect the rights of conscience and religious liberty, particularly when it's based on reason and deeply held beliefs that are a long part of our tradition.
So you just leave that up to the courts?
Well, you don't have a case. In other words, there's no
what
particular,
about
you're making up a hypothetical which is not operative in our system. I can't think of anybody out there who would do that because it's unreasonable. And then if there was a case in which that occurred by somebody who's on the margins or some entity that's on the margins, I think the courts are well handled to deal with that type of dynamic. But it's a hypothetical on the extremes. What we're talking about are not hypothetical on the extremes. We're talking about on August 1st, the government comes in and tells Catholic institutions or employers who have a reasoned belief that they have to do things like provide abortion-inducing drugs that are inconsistent with the generally accepted norms in this society that we've lived with comfortably until a year and a half ago. So.
For a real case, maybe then Christian scientists who don't believe in providing certain forms of prescription drugs, like that's come to the Supreme Court, do you think that they should get an exemption as well, Christian scientist employers?
Would a person have another option in that regard? That's another reason. That's another part of what you'd have to look at.
If it's very expensive
if there's
drugs.
Do you have a case? You don't have a specific case.
No, I don't know the name of the Supreme Court.
Right, you're thinking of hypotheticals. This is not a hypothetical, what's happening right now.
No, it is.
A large part of America is potentially going to be affected by this ruling in a manner that's inconsistent with the way in which we've handled healthcare up to this point. So to address, though, your question, courts are well suited to handle things that are on the margins or on the extreme, but that's not what this is at all. So you can't jump, I don't think, logically from what we're talking about using exceptions, hypotheticals that you can't find cases for in order to undermine the general principle here. So that's what I submit to you as an answer.
Unless anyone else would like to comment on this, I think we've got another question.
Hi, I'm Galen Carey with the National Association of Evangelicals. thanks to all of you for your support for religious freedom, to Congressman Fortenberry, especially your support for conscience rights and your leadership, and to Congressman Lipinski for taking a stand that hasn't been popular among many in your party. We appreciate that. I guess my question is, a lot of the debate over the health care law in general and this HHS mandate has been, shall I say, over the top. And I'm wondering if there are any efforts that any of you could talk about where you've tried to reach out to some of your colleagues who disagree on this issue to try to win the support that we would need in order to get a legislative fix actually passed. And is there a way to tone down rhetoric, and is that helpful or necessary, or do you think that the way things are unfolding now is the way it needs to happen?
Is there a legislative fix to the HHS mandate, in your view?
I think it's become very, unfortunately, in my party, it has become such an issue of, it's become so politicized, extremely politicized, and it's very hard right now in the middle of a presidential campaign to get that toned down and to really talk about this in a very straightforward, logical manner. And I hate to say that, but unfortunately that is the case. I think that we could pass right now in the House. We could probably pass Jeff's bill, but we know it's not going to go anywhere in the Senate. That's certainly the way that it seems, and I think that's why it has not been acted upon. That's the way I see it. And I wish that it were the case, that we could speak about this and sort of work together on this in a way that I wish we could do a lot of things like that, but this is especially radioactive of an issue, and unfortunately it has not seemed to work.
Does the court decision change that dynamic at all, do you think, the political dynamic here, given the fact that now this thing is constitutional? One reads that some Democrats were hoping it would be declared unconstitutional because it is so unpopular politically, the law, the general law. Does that change at all the dynamic on this particular aspect of it in the Freedom of Conscience bill?
I don't think so right now. It's hard to know what impact the law being upheld has, except what it does is makes the whole law even more, if it could be, more hyper-political, because now it's going to be, I'm sure if he hasn't said it already, Mitt Romney will come out and say, well, now the only way to stop this law is to elect me. And it will just ratchet up this being a political issue, because the hope against just throwing the whole thing out was lost in the courts. There's only a political way, and I think it'll just make it even hotter of a political issue, if that's possible.
I just want one comment along with, I think for all of us, it's very important that we keep the debate and the discussion up at this level. Diane mentioned earlier, this is not a Catholic issue. This is not a contraceptive issue. This is a freedom of religion issue, one of the most fundamental tenets of the United States of America. And that's where we need to have this discussion and debate.
Yes, ma'am.
Point.
Would you lower the mic a little bit, please?
Sure. My name is Carrie Devra, God in the Temples of Government. I have a point and a question to the gentleman on my left, and a question to the legislators, one of which the doctors sort of broached on. My point is, I'm learning to use an Android, and it auto-predicts what my thoughts it wants it to be, and I typed in Sebelius's last name yesterday, and it came out senility. I just thought I would share that. My question to the gentleman...
Sorry, could you repeat that?
I have a hard time hearing.
And speak a little
louder?
slowly.
I'm sorry.
We're having trouble hearing you up here.
I have an Android. It's about a week old, and it auto-predicts what my thoughts are. I spend significant time arguing with it, but I enjoyed and tweeted that my Sebelius typing yesterday, it auto-predicted senility. So my question to the gentleman on the left is there a coincidence to the conversation to Sandra Flux hearing on the Hill? And is this part of a strategy that you're staggering your conversations as they have been? And to the legislators, my question, if I can get it to hold still, the rhetoric is being distracted by everybody who's got blue hair, pink hair, green hair, orange shoes, 2 shoes, 1 shoe. Is there a way to pull the rhetoric back to a model that says this is for everybody and stops wasting your time as legislators on the Hill for everybody who thinks that they're the only one with that goal of health care, and to make it more of a general model that can then be expanded upon? But so it's no longer a Jew, a Christian, a Muslim, an African, Australian, and so on.
Very good, thank you.
I think it's actually a very good point. I've strived to do that. And by the way, I think the gentleman's name was Mr. Kelly before. Kerry, I meant to commend, it's a good question and it's a good point that you made earlier, and it's one that has to be worked through reasoned debate, and I hope I gave you a responsible answer in that regard. And that's to say that the tone of the dynamic should be about confronting what I think are responsible arguments for, and confronting or giving credence to responsible arguments for this, confronting illogical or problematic arguments, but in a reasoned fashion, elevating it to the level of principle in which we're talking about a long-held American tradition, a long-held American right that's consistent with the natural rights of the person from which the rights of conscience and religious liberty flow. If you start over there, then it is about this group versus this group, that group. So to return to first principles here, I think is in order. I try to do that a bit in my speech. I hope it came through. But I think I agree with your general assessment, even though it was predicted by your android, which troubles me. But thank you.
Okay, is that Richard?
Hi, Rich Dorflinger, yeah. It's kind of presumptuous of me to answer a previous question, but I think the Respect for Rights of Conscience Act leaves intact the guarantees of the Americans with Disabilities Act, and also has a provision that the conscience claims in the Act cannot be used to deny treatment of people based on disability. HIV is a disability. Therefore, I think the simple answer is no. This is not part of a campaign to deny treatment of people with HIV.
Nor does it impact the Civil Rights Act or the Pregnancy Non-Discrimination Act and other legal precedents as set out there by Congress.
So those protections also stand. But what I wanted to shift the question a little bit to the freedom of the individual, because I've seen the administration shift its argument away from the compelling interest is to get everybody on birth control. Somebody may have mentioned China, they got scared, but to ensure that women can make their own health care decisions. The compelling interest is in women's reproductive freedom to make decisions. Now, they make those, even if they work for a Catholic employer, they make those decisions now. It's just the church will not help them pay for it or contract for them to get it, but they still have the freedom. But what's been interesting to me, and I don't know if it's part of the calculation here, is that the latest development in regulatory terms in the administration, the advance notice, says that for a Catholic institution that can't get the exemption, the coverage, which they used to talk about as being offered to the female employees, will be provided automatically to all employees and their beneficiaries with guarantees of privacy. So it seems to me that the threat to the conscience of the individual, let's assume that at least some people who work for Catholic institutions want to follow Catholic teaching and believe it, not only don't have their own individual right of conscience, but they don't have the right to help determine their minor children's dealings with sexuality and contraception, because their children will automatically be covered for all of this and for the counseling to promote it, and there'll be protections of privacy from their parents. So is there also are we in danger of forgetting the individual conscience in our effort to say the institution has rights as well? Is there an individual freedom issue here and a parental rights issue?
I've talked too much, so you all go.
I would say that this is all about the individual's conscience. This is about the nurse who does not want to go in and start the IV for someone who is going to have an abortion, and that we empower her and we make sure that she is not retaliated against or fired or there are any consequences because she adheres to her conscience. I think we're talking about individual consciences. I think that saying that an employer doesn't have to provide abortion, abortifacient drugs or sterilization or contraception, yes, we're protecting his conscience, and then it's up to the individual. I think we got to be honest here. Contraception is available everywhere. It is available everywhere. They're in our schools starting in what grade? Educating the kids and making it available to them. So I think it then becomes, if the employer, we protect his conscience, and then it's up to the employee. If they want to get contraception, we're just saying he does not have to provide it, that they can go elsewhere and get it.
Yes, ma'am.
My name's Molly Wheeler. I'm a student. I was wondering, this entire time we've been talking about like the individual's conscience, and what exactly would you define as like a valid conscience, in the sense that the First Amendment gives all Americans the right to believe or not believe any faith within reason. And at times, different individuals, I'm not sure that plural of consciences, but one person's conscience will not always align with another's. And how do you, is there any way to resolve that? Do you see any solution within that? And, tying it to the context of following the law, following your individual beliefs, and kind of bringing those all into symmetry, I guess.
Dan?
Yeah, thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. Well, I think it's very clear that the Catholic Church has defined what is contrary to their conscience. And as Anne Marie said, this whole issue of, someone who is even a member of the Catholic Church that maybe doesn't necessarily think that this is what they need to do, there is availability out there for birth control. But it even goes beyond that with what they're going to require that be provided. I mean, it's beyond birth control. I know the whole conversation that has been in the media has been turned to just that, because that is so much more of an acceptable kind of care that people are getting. But this is well defined by the church. And so I don't think that we have to define what is a conscience here of the church. And that's why I believe that this is so significant, is that we have got history and a long history of what the Catholic Church does believe in.
Well, I think your question goes to the heart of it. Are you a philosophy student, or to the heart of the nature of nature itself? What is the person? We all have attributes that we hold in common. That's just self-evident, clearly. Now, when you have somebody that engages in some sort of warped, bizarre, perverse behavior, we have something called the common good and the means of ordering society for justice. And so we suggest that there needs to be laws, because human nature is fallen and it can go astray, and there are sicknesses that sometimes distort and perverse. That's not what we're talking, pervert a person's decisions. That's not what we're talking about here. The previous gentleman spoke to the fact that the government is now going to basically talk to children in private, or can talk to children in private, and empower them to engage in certain sexual behavior because the government thinks that's compelling. And it is trampling the idea of the right of the individual parent to have appropriate control, to order and raise their child with right reason and good outcomes. Is that a compelling reason for the government to engage in this activity? I don't think so. So the right of conscience is, yes, it's a broad principle, but it's self-evident given the nature of who we are as individuals. It can go astray, but again, we have means of societal ordering to protect basic freedoms by restricting certain activities that are inconsistent with the origin of freedom itself. But that doesn't, again, this is a philosophical debate about where this power comes from. Does it come from the government to confer it? Does it come from the Institute of Medicine, which was a stacked panel, by the way, of people who don't hold this particular worldview? Do we turn our conscience rights over to a few people who then have the authority and power to tell us what to do, even when it violates long-standing traditional norms that have been consistent with right reason? I don't think so. So a little bit longer.
Great question.
Thank you.
Just as we arranged to have the Supreme Court start this session, we have one last question to end it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Kieran Ravel, Georgetown College, 2013. Thank you all for your presentations. I'd like to direct this question perhaps to...
Could you speak a little more slowly and into
sorry.
the mic?
Direct this question perhaps to our representatives who also have the experience in the healthcare field. Could you perhaps paint a picture legislatively, in terms of regulation, in terms of the healthcare industry, of what may happen if Catholic hospitals or other healthcare institutions start shutting down if this regulation, this law is not brought back? What is the impact on our country? Because there's been talk of it. Cardinal George in Chicago has spoken recently on it. From your perspective as healthcare providers and legislators, could you paint a picture of what that looks like? And are there any conversations going on right now in Congress, in the administration, in HHS, of perhaps, what are the backup plans in place if these institutions start shutting down? Thank you.
Well, I can tell you again, I'm not Catholic, but I did most of my nursing career in Catholic hospitals. And obviously, they have provided tremendous care across this entire country. And to lose a whole group of providers that have given such wonderful care, I think would just really be not only for the lack of what might be the services that are in those areas that they're already providing service, and there might not even be another service provider, in the lack of care provided in that area, but also for a system that has for so many years had such a outstanding history of providing the kind of care that we want to see provided in this country. It will break my heart if that happens because, again, I have spent so much of my career in Catholic hospitals, so it would be pretty devastating in many areas.
And I would just add to that, I mentioned already the Catholic hospital in my district, which is the leading heart treatment center in central New York, that they will make that shift. We've already seen Catholic institutions who are not going to carry health insurance and coverage for their students any longer. And I think what we're going to see is and I must say, because I have been frustrated with my Catholic Church for a lot of years, I am very proud of, and I hope that they stand firm, that Cardinal Dolan has made it clear, and I think we're going to see, again, in the court cases, they have sued, and we'll see the outcomes of those cases, and maybe that will change the dynamic. Diane mentioned in her opening remarks about repealing the health care law, or at the very least, repealing this mandate. So I think you're going to see a whole range of things that will happen immediately if this goes into effect August 1st. The legal challenges are out there. The Catholic Church has made it clear they're not going to, they've drawn a line in the sand, which I think is what we have to do, because once you make an exception, once you say, okay, I will give you this much, you open the door. And this is such a, I've said this a couple of times, such a vital part of who we are as a nation. It goes to the very soul of the United States of America. People came here for religious freedom. They came here so they could adhere to their conscience and they could practice their religion freely. And so it's the very foundation of who we are as a nation. And so we had a hearing in Oversight and Government Reform, and we had an archbishop there from the Catholic Church, but we also had the Southern Evangelicals, we had a rabbi, we had the Lutheran Church there. This is not a Catholic issue. This goes to the very fundamental right of every American to practice or to not practice religion in the United States of America. So the ramifications of this are so significant, and that's why having this forum today and having this discussion and keeping this awareness in all of the American people is so very important It goes to the preservation of what the United States of America stands for.
If I may just add just one additional thing to that is, not only have I seen the quality of care, but I've also seen within the Catholic Church the outreach into those areas that the for-profit hospitals just either do not have that as a mission, or maybe don't have the money to do that. But I have seen the Catholic Church reach out to those populations that really do not have access to health care, and to be able to provide something that others cannot. And I think that will also be a real impact, especially to the rural communities. I have a lot of those in my district that are being serviced by the Catholic hospitals that have reached out to them.
I could make a quick comment on that. I received an email from a friend of mine who's a medical doctor, and his view was quite cynical. He said this is a government attempt to push Catholic health care out of the marketplace. Why would the government want to even give Catholic institutions, other institutions, people of goodwill, such a dilemma? Whether to be in obedience to their government, which comes from the consent of the governed, by the way, back to your question, or whether to violate their conscience, or third, whether to disobey. And that may be what you're seeing next. There may be very good, courageous Americans out there who say, I will continue to treat the sick and heal the wounded and serve the poor as I always have. And I will not let the government do this to me, either shut me down or violate my conscience. August 1st is the day it starts.
Well, it's, I think, appropriate that we end on that very, very sobering point. Thank you all for some terrific questions and a wonderful conversation. Please join me in thanking our panelists for an excellent opportunity. Thank you all for coming. Please sign up if you aren't already for our newsletter. We look forward to another conversation on religious liberty.